2 wives, 17 years apart, both gone after quiet getaways with the same man. At first, they were called accidents, unthinkable twists of fate. But behind every tragic story, sometimes there's a pattern. And behind that pattern, a plan. This is the case of Harold Henthorn, the man who turned trust into tragedy and love into a question mark.
Harold Henthorn lived a seemingly ordinary life, a husband, a father, and a churchgoer. He was known as a thoughtful, if somewhat quiet man. However, as investigators would later uncover, his life was marked by 2 tragedies. In 1995, Harold's first wife, Lynn, died during a drive in rural Colorado. They had pulled over to fix a flat tire, and according to Harold, she was struck by their vehicle. The case was ruled an accident, and there was no foul play suspected at the time. Harold moved forward. He remarried in 2000 to Dr. Tony Henthorn, a successful ophthalmologist. The couple appeared to enjoy a peaceful life together, raising their young daughter. They often vacationed, hiked, and spent time in the mountains they both loved. In 2012, the family took a weekend trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. It was meant to be a celebration of their 12th wedding anniversary. They hiked Deer Mountain, a trail Tony had never done before. At some point during the hike, Tony fell from a cliff and died. Harold told rescuers she had stopped to take a photo and lost her footing. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late to save her. News of the fall spread quickly, another tragic accident in a place of beauty. Harold was interviewed by park officials and cooperated with investigators. He expressed deep grief and cited past tragedies in his life. But behind the scenes, park rangers had concerns. His story seemed inconsistent. His phone records didn't quite add up, and something about the way the day unfolded raised red flags. Harold had called for help, but only after a suspicious delay, and questions about his past began to emerge. It wouldn't take long before old wounds reopened. As investigators reviewed the case, they began to notice troubling patterns. This wasn't Harold's first wife to die under unusual circumstances. The 1995 accident involving Lynn came back into focus. Detectives examined the scene reports, timelines, and insurance records from both tragedies. In both cases, Harold was the only witness. In both, emergency help had been delayed. And in both cases, large life insurance policies had been in place. For Tony, the total insurance exceeded $4 million. She hadn't been aware of all the policies Harold had taken out in her name. Investigators noted that Tony's family and friends had expressed concerns in recent years. She had grown more reserved and stressed, particularly about finances. Some reported that she didn't have full access to their accounts. The trail on Deer Mountain was considered safe for novice hikers. It was broad and scenic, not especially steep or treacherous. But the spot where Tony fell was remote, off the marked path. Records showed that Harold had mapped out that specific area well in advance. Cell data revealed he had been at the site weeks before. He had also removed a map from Tony's backpack before rescuers arrived. Investigators also learned Harold had told conflicting stories to different people. He told some that Tony had taken a photo and slipped. To others, he said she had been kneeling to rest. The story changed just enough to cast doubt. Forensic experts began reconstructing the fall site and examining Tony's injuries. And with each discovery, the theory of an accident became harder to believe. Federal investigation was opened. This was no longer a case of tragedy, it was becoming something else. Federal prosecutors began working closely with park rangers and forensic analysts. Their goal: to determine whether Tony's death was intentional. And whether Harold Henthorn had planned it. They examined his financial records, search history, and the timeline of events. They discovered Harold had used burner phone's secret devices for unknown communication. He also created a hidden folder on his computer titled Emergency Plan. Investigators pieced together a disturbing possibility: that Harold had staged both incidents, years apart to look like accidents, and that money, particularly life insurance, was a common factor in both. Tony had trusted Harold. She had no reason to suspect harm, but the evidence suggested she had not simply fallen. She had been alone with someone who controlled the narrative. Prosecutors contacted friends, co-workers, and family to build a timeline. They also reviewed Harold's behavior after both deaths. In both instances, he acted quickly to collect insurance payouts. What was striking was how little emotion he seemed to show. Several friends described him as oddly composed. Even days after Tony's death, he was asking about finances. By 2014, a grand jury indicted Harold Henthorn for the first-degree murder of his wife. The trial would be held in federal court. Due to the death occurring in a national park, Harold pleaded not guilty and maintained it was a tragic accident. But the jury would hear two stories, one of coincidence and one of careful planning. The prosecution laid out a case built on digital footprints, insurance documents, and expert testimony. The pattern was hard to ignore. The trial began in September 2015. In Denver. It would last 2 weeks and include over 60 witnesses. Tony's family and friends sat quietly in the courtroom. The prosecution argued that Harold had lured Tony to a remote trail, that he had pushed her from a cliff to collect life insurance, and that it wasn't the first time. They presented cell tower evidence, digital planning files, and maps found on Harold's devices. They showed how the area where Tony fell had been researched in advance. And how Tony had no idea of the insurance policies in place. The defense insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that Harold's odd behavior was due to grief, and that there was no direct proof of a push. But the jury saw a disturbing pattern, a blueprint repeated. 2 wives, 2 accidents, and 1 common thread. Harold. And this time, the outcome would be different. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty. Harold Henthorn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Tony's family expressed quiet gratitude. They remembered her not for the way she died, but for the life she lived. Smart, kind, driven, and a devoted mother. Harold's daughter was placed in the care of family. Those close to her have asked for privacy and compassion, and the public has largely respected that request. Today, hikers still walk Deer Mountain, unaware of its past, but for those who followed the case, it remains a place touched by sorrow and strength. The story of Tony and Lynn reminds us that patterns matter and justice, even when delayed, can arrive.
It's genuinely unsettling when you think about it. How's someone's life seemingly so normal on the surface?
Yeah, it can hide some really dark secrets. We look at people, neighbors, colleagues, and we think we know them.
Right. But then something happens, that facade just crumbles, and suddenly you see this pattern emerge, a disturbing one.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. We're doing a deep dive into the Harold Henthorn case. It's a really troubling story about the deaths of his two wives. Very suspicious deaths.
Exactly. And just to be clear, our goal here isn't, speculation. We want to carefully unpack what happened, the key events, those concerning patterns that came out based on the documentary script we looked at, trying to make sense of it without getting lost in every single detail.
And at the heart of it are two absolute tragedies. First, back in 1995, Harold's first wife, Lynn, died. Then, much later, 2012, his second wife, Dr. Tony Henthorn, she died in Rocky Mountain National Park.
Seemed like separate events initially.
Totally separate tragedies, years apart, but they ended up being chillingly connected.
Okay, so let's start with Harold himself. What was the picture? You said ordinary.
Yeah, from the outside looking in, he seemed like a regular guy, husband, father eventually, went to church, just blended in, not someone you'd necessarily look twice at.
Okay, so 1995, his first wife, Lynn. What happened there?
They were out in rural Colorado. Harold's story was they had a flat tire, stopped the car, and somehow while they were dealing with it, she was hit by their own vehicle.
Hit by their own car.
Yeah, that was his account. And tragically, she died from it.
And at the time, people just accepted that. An accident.
It was ruled an accident. Doesn't seem like there were major suspicions raised then. Life went on for Harold. And then in 2000, he got remarried.
To Dr. Tony Henthorn.
Right. A successful ophthalmologist. And again, outwardly seemed like a happy life. They had a daughter together.
Okay, so fast forward to 2012, the anniversary trip.
That's exactly. Their 12th anniversary. They go to Rocky Mountain National Park for the weekend, planned to hike Deer Mountain. It was actually a trail Tony hadn't hiked before. It's supposed to be a celebration.
But it wasn't.
No. During the hike, Tony fell from a cliff. Died from the fall.
And Harold's explanation.
He told the rescuers who arrived that she'd stopped to take a picture, lost her footing, slipped. Just a terrible, tragic accident in the mountains.
Which sadly does happen. It sounds plausible on the surface.
It does, initially. But the park rangers, the first responders on scene, they started noticing things. Little things that didn't quite sit right.
Quite.
Inconsistencies in Harold's story, for one. What he said happened didn't perfectly line up. Then they looked at phone records, his timeline. Again, discrepancies. And maybe the biggest thing.
What's that?
How long it took him to call for help. There was a significant delay. These little flags started popping up.
Okay, so these doubts about Tony's death, they actually led investigators to look back at Lynn's death from 95.
That's exactly what happened. It's kind of the crux of it. The weird circumstances around Tony's fall made them think, wait a minute. Didn't his first wife also die in unusual circumstances?
So that connection was the trigger.
It seems so. Suddenly, Lynn's 1995 accident, which had been closed, was under a microscope again. Detectives started pulling everything.
What kind of things?
Old scene reports, timelines from back then, and, really importantly, they started comparing insurance records from both cases, looking for, patterns.
And did they find them?
Oh, yeah. A really disturbing common thread started to emerge. In both deaths, Lynn's and Tony's.
Harold was the only witness.
Harold was the only one there, and in both cases, help was delayed. Getting emergency services took longer than you might expect. Taken together, these parallels, they just felt significant.
And then there was the money, the insurance.
Right, that became a huge factor. It turned out there were substantial life insurance policies on both wives. For Tony, it was over $4 million total.
$4 million, wow.
And here's the kicker. Tony apparently wasn't even aware of all the policies Harold had taken out on her.
She didn't know. Oh, that changes things, doesn't it? Suddenly it's not just tragedy, it's potential motive.
It absolutely shifted the perspective. And then you had Tony's family and friends coming forward.
What are they saying?
They mentioned noticing changes in Tony in the years before she died, said she'd become more withdrawn, seemed really stressed about their finances, and some mentioned she seemed to have limited access to their money, their accounts.
Suggesting maybe control issues, isolation.
It certainly paints a picture that investigators had to look at closely. Then you add the location itself. Deer Mountain.
You said it was a trail she hadn't hiked before?
Right, and it's generally described as a pretty safe, popular trail, not overly difficult. But where Tony fell, it was way off the marked path, a remote, dangerous spot.
How'd they even end up there?
Well, this is where it gets really suspicious. The investigation found evidence, digital evidence, that Harold had researched that exact spot, mapped it out beforehand.
Before the anniversary hike.
Weeks before. Cell phone data even put his phone near that location weeks prior to the trip. It wasn't just a random wander off the trail, it seems.
Suggests planning. And what about his story of how she fell? Taking a photo.
That's another inconsistency. He told some people she was taking a picture and slipped, told others she was, kneeling down to rest and lost her balance. The story shifted depending on who he talked to.
Which is often a red flag, right?
Right.
Genuine accidents usually have a clearer, consistent narrative.
Exactly. So forensic teams got involved. They did a reconstruction of the fall site, looked closely at Tony's injuries, and the more they analyzed it, the less likely an accidental fall seemed.
So all this leads to a bigger investigation.
Yes. Federal authorities stepped in. Because Tony died in a national park, which is federal land, it became a federal case. The FBI got involved. The narrative definitely shifted from accident to potential homicide.
Okay, so federal prosecutors take the lead. And their job now is to figure out definitively, was this an accident or was it planned murder?
That was the core question. And they really dove deep. Looked into Harold's finances, his internet searches, meticulously mapped out the timeline leading up to Tony's death. Every click, every dollar spent became potential evidence.
And they found things.
They did. Some very unsettling discoveries, like burner phones. Those prepaid phones people sometimes use to avoid being tracked?
Okay, yeah, not typical.
And even more chilling, a hidden folder on his computer labeled emergency plan.
Emergency plan? Wow. That sounds premeditated.
It certainly points in that direction, doesn't it? And this is where the most disturbing possibility really solidified, that Harold might have staged both wives' deaths years apart, primarily for the insurance money.
The similarities were just too much to ignore.
Far too much. It seemed less and less like coincidence.
That tragedy for Tony, thinking she's on an anniversary trip, trusting her husband completely, likely had no idea.
Heartbreaking to consider. Prosecutors also gathered a lot of testimony from Tony's friends, colleagues, family, trying to build that timeline, understand the relationship dynamics, note any odd behavior Harold exhibited.
Speaking of odd behavior, what about after the deaths? How did Harold act?
That also came under scrutiny. In both cases, he reportedly moved quite quickly to claim the insurance money, and people who knew him described him as strangely calm. Oddly composed was a phrase used.
Not necessarily typical grief-stricken behavior.
Not what many expected. Some reported he was asking about financial matters quite soon after Tony died. All these pieces, the inconsistencies, the money motive, the digital trail, the behavior, it all added up.
Leading to
Harold Henthorn's indictment in 2014. First-degree murder of Tony. And because it was federal land, it was a federal charge.
And his plea.
He pleaded not guilty, maintained it was a terrible, tragic accident, just like Lynn's death.
So setting the stage for a trial, accident versus a calculated pattern. A lot of it sounds circumstantial, though. No one actually saw him push her.
Right. A lot was circumstantial. No direct eyewitness to a push. But the prosecution felt the weight of all that circumstantial evidence. The pattern, the motive, the planning was overwhelming.
Okay, so the trial begins September 2015.
Yes, in Denver. It lasted about 2 weeks. Over 60 witnesses testified. And Tony's family, her friends, they were there every single day, quietly watching, hoping for justice.
What was the prosecution's core argument in court?
Pretty straightforward, really. They argued Harold lured Tony to that remote spot, pretending it was part of the hike, and then pushed her off the cliff. Why? For the insurance money. And they presented it as a chilling repeat of what might have happened to Lynn years before.
And the key evidence they hammered home.
Several things. The cell tower data showing them both at that exact spot. The digital files, the maps, the research he did on that specific location beforehand, and critically, proving Tony didn't know about all those insurance policies.
How did the defense respond to that? Must have been tough.
Their main argument was that Harold's behavior, seeming odd or composed, was just his way of grieving. Shock, maybe. And they stressed, repeatedly, there was no direct proof, no smoking gun, no witness saying, I saw him push her. They tried to portray him as a man devastated by losing 2 wives in accidents.
But the jury, what do they seem to focus on?
It really seemed to come down to that pattern. Like you said earlier, 2 wives, 2 supposed accidents, 2 times. Harold is the only one there. The sheer number of parallels. It just seemed too much for them to accept as coincidence.
And the verdict?
After about 10 hours of deliberation, they came back. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder.
So he was sentenced.
Yes, life in prison. No possibility of parole. He'll spend the rest of his life behind bars.
What was the reaction from Tony's family? Relief.
A quiet sense of closure, I think. Relief that justice was served. They made statements focusing on Tony's life, not just her death. Her intelligence, her kindness, how driven she was, and especially how devoted she was as a mother, remembering her.
And their daughter, Harold and Tony's daughter.
She was placed with family members. And understandably, her privacy has been paramount. It's just a reminder of the ripple effects. So many lives impacted.
Yeah. So Deer Mountain.
Yeah.
It's still a place people hike, obviously.
It is. People still go there for the beauty. But now it carries this other history, a place of deep sadness, but also maybe a place where the truth eventually came out, where justice, however delayed, arrived. It really highlights how important recognizing those patterns can be.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the key takeaways really are pretty stark, aren't they? Those chilling parallels between the deaths.
Undeniable parallels. And the huge financial motive hanging over everything.
And how crucial all that circumstantial evidence ended up being, the digital trail, the inconsistencies, putting it all together.
Absolutely. It really achieved a measure of justice in the end.
It leaves you thinking, though, about trust. How well can you ever really know someone, even the people closest to you?
It definitely makes you consider that. Or maybe think about the power of those little details, the patterns that emerge when you look closely enough. How they can uncover truths hidden beneath layers and layers of lies. Something to reflect on, for sure.